Hello, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to IEA Bioenergy webinar series. My name is Chiara Benetti, and I welcome you on behalf of ETA Florence Renewable Energies, technical organizer of this webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Utilization and Storage of Captured Biogenic CO2 Deployment in Selected EU Countries. The webinar will be moderated by Christiane Hennig, Senior Research Associate at the German Biomass Research Center, TBFZ, and it will be presented by David Stiles, Associate Professor in Agri-Sustainability at the School of Biological and Chemical Sciences and Rhine Institute, University of Galway, by Karin Pettersson, Senior Researcher and Project Manager at the Research Institutes of Sweden, Jens Fuhrmann, Head of Strategic Development, BECCS, at RWE, and Christian Bank, Senior Consultant at EEA Energy Analysis. As usual, you have the possibility to drop questions by using the Q&A tab that you can find at the bottom of the screen. Please do only use the Q&A tab for questions and do not use the chat box. That is for just for greetings. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording of the webinar will be available from tomorrow on IEA Bioenergy website, as well as all presentations. That's all by my side. So now I'll give the floor to Christiane and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. So I will just quickly share my screen to give you the, sorry. This was not. So my screen is hopefully shared with you.
Not yet.
Not yet. 1 second. So now it must be.
Yes.
And now it's on presentation mode, hopefully.
Perfect.
So, perfect. Thank you, Chiara, again for this backup. So also welcome from my side to this IEA Bioenergy webinar on the utilization and storage of captured biogenic CO2. It's a webinar from Task 40. Task 40 is on deployment of bio-based value chains. And today I'm moderating the session. My name is Christiane Hennig, and I'm a senior scientist at DBFZ German Biomass Research Center, where I'm focusing on bio-based value chains. And here also in specific on the deployment end, so looking into bioenergy, biomass applications. And here, of course, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and utilization, as well as bio-based hydrogen are the topics that we are looking in, and myself at the moment. I'm also the co-lead of IEA Bioenergy Task 40 and coordinating together with my colleague Christian Bang from Denmark, who is also participating and the speaker of this webinar today, the IEA Bioenergy Task 40 and the IEA Bioenergy BECCS and BECCU activities. And here I want to just start to give you some background information more on our IEA Bioenergy activities. So with BECCS and BECCU, we're dealing with already since 2019. So since then, we have considerations within Task 40, but also among different tasks. So we have an inter-task project where different tasks join with their expertise, and then we're looking into different aspects of bringing BECCS into more deployment. So everything what is needed to have there more applications. This whole inter-task activity is then coordinated by us at Task 40. And the main aspects that we are looking in currently is really presenting different examples. Here we think of case studies. So have different projects that are about to released or about to kicked off, to present them and to show and describe their successes and their challenges. So to have lessons learned and then publish them as well, these findings. Then what is of course important to bring these cases to life and to deployment, we need the aspects that are around. So what is needed to accelerate, what are the business strategies, but of course also the climate effects to show them and also reflect on the comparison to other CDR technologies. And at the end, bring everything together and really give guidance on governance so that BECCUS, meaning utilization and storage, can be adopted and upscaled. So that brings me to our today's webinar. So actually the idea is today to really give you the first results and also inputs that we have come so far. Here we want to start to provide first a background. So to rather really describe first again the topic bioenergy with carbon capture and storage and bioenergy and carbon capture and utilization, then also reflect on this aspect of biogenic CO2, as this is a very important topic also to achieve negative emissions and also in comparison to fossil CO2. And this is also something that really belongs to biomass, and we want to shed some light on this aspect. And this then goes hand in hand to the real projects that we want to present. So here we have a selection from different countries in the European Union. And here you will hear from the different speakers what is the status on different projects, but also what is the policy or the governance around to bring these projects into deployment. So as first speaker, we will have Dave Stiles today. Dave is associate professor at the University of Galway, and he is also a member of IEA Bioenergy Task 40, which is the task on sustainability and climate effects of bioenergy and a broader bioeconomy. So Dave will give us now the background information on BECCS, BECCU, biogenic CO2 and negative emissions, and also reflect on the different climate effects. So Dave, I will stop sharing my screen and then hand over to you so you can start sharing your slides. Thank you, Dave.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Christiane. So we'll first go over the usual hump of making sure that we can share slides correctly. I'm hoping that you can see my screen at this stage.
Yes, it's visible, Dave.
That's great. Thank you, Christiane. Okay, so yeah, thanks very much, Christiane. As Christiane mentioned, I'm part of Task 45, and we're particularly interested in understanding the climate effects of bioenergy, and in this case, we're focusing on BECCUS. So firstly, I'll just give a quick background about what BECCUS is, very high level, simple terms, and then look at some of the climate effects that we might attribute to BECCUS and why it might be a very interesting series of technologies in terms of climate policy. So firstly, just down to the basics, what's BECCS? There's BECCS and there's BECCU, and BECCS is the capture and permanent storage of biogenic carbon dioxide from processes where biomass is converted into fuels or directly burned to generate energy. And the interesting point about BECCS is that you're taking CO2 specifically from biogenic sources, so that as the biomass grows, it sequesters the carbon out of the atmosphere. Therefore, if you capture that CO2 upon combustion or other conversion technology and you put it down into deep geological storage, you're effectively creating a pathway to remove long-term CO2 from the atmosphere. So therefore, it becomes a negative emission technology. And that's something very unique to BECCS and very unique to the CCS application, specifically to biogenic carbon, not to fossil carbon. So we really do need to distinguish between fossil CCS and biomass CCS. Well, we also have BECCU, and this is where we can utilize the biogenic carbon dioxide from processes where the biomass is converted into fuels or directly burned for energy. So here we're trying to capture those CO2 emissions, and then we're putting them into either new fuels, so-called e-fuels, which can be used to decarbonize difficult to decarbonize sectors such as shipping or aviation, or we can also put that carbon, that biogenic carbon, back into polymers, biopolymers, such as producing bioplastics, for example. And that becomes interesting as a pathway of getting multiple substitutions from the biogenic carbon. We're not just getting one substitution, but multiple substitutions potentially we can keep recycling that biogenic carbon as well if we put it into polymers, biopolymers, and that's a way of storing carbon out of the atmosphere very long term to have a similar effect to BECCS over a certain time period. So those concepts are extremely important given the urgency of the climate challenge and the need to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. That's a quick summary of BECCS and BECCU. Now, just to emphasize this point, there's been a lot of research that's been looking at the impact of taking carbon out of the terrestrial environment. So we remove carbon from forests when we harvest the forests, or we remove carbon from agricultural landscapes. And there's been some criticism about the impact of removing carbon from the terrestrial biosphere because we reduce those carbon stocks. BECCS can potentially really transform how we see the long-term dynamics linked with that extraction of biogenic carbon. We can think of forest cycles where we have a sigmoidal growth curve and the forests start to grow slowly, then they grow fast, and then they grow slowly, and then they stop growing, and they reach an equilibrium. Now, if we continuously harvest those forests and use it for high-value products and potentially cascade down and use side streams or end-of-life streams to go into BECCS, that's a pathway to permanently remove that carbon from the atmosphere. So we don't have this trade-off anymore about carbon in the biosphere versus carbon in the built environment displacing other fossil type emissions or concrete emissions. So really BECCS can really fundamentally transform the way we look at the dynamics of managing biomass and harvesting biomass through time, which is very important. The other important thing about that is that as climate change accelerates and has impacts on biogenic carbon storage and ecosystems, we know these ecosystems are at risk from droughts, from extreme events, from forest fires, etc. So actually BECCS is a way of taking some carbon out of those vulnerable ecosystems and putting it into that safe long-term storage to keep us out of the atmosphere. So there's a resilience aspect to this too, which could be very important. Now, kind of modeling all this becomes a little bit complicated. It requires a different perspective from how we often do life cycle assessments. But this is just a very, very highly simplified approach to looking at what we mean here when we talk about these different types of carbon storage. So on the top, you see in the green, this is a very simplified representation of carbon dynamics in a growing and then harvested forest. So we harvest a forest, we lose a lot of biogenic carbon in that forest. That forest starts to grow again slowly through time, and then it reaches a period where it gets to its maximum kind of standing biomass determined to be the economic volume for harvesting. It's harvested, we go back to a regrowing forest. So we have these cycles of biogenic carbon in the forest. Now, in a conventional bioenergy scenario, we might harvest that wood. Some might go into long-term products, but the fraction that goes into biomass for bioenergy would then displace fossil fuels. And so we'd get a credit, if you like, by avoiding emissions of CO2 from fossil fuels, which reduces our impact on climate change. And that's shaded in the orange section here. The argument of many critics, if you like, of bioenergy is that this credit is not big enough to offset the loss of carbon that we have in the ecosystem. So we have a net negative impact and net climate change contribution. Now, BECCS could really change that fundamentally. I mean, I should mention firstly that previous argument is perhaps missing some important issues around side streams and other products being used from forests that go into long-term storage, which kind of a very beneficial effect. But BECCS can really change that in any case, because we can then start to store much of the carbon that we lose in the forests or other ecosystems in geological storage. We do lose conversion efficiency because we take some parasitic energy to capture that CO2 and to lock it away and transport it and put it into oil wells. So that does take energy, but we can still avoid some fossil energy, which gives us a credit. We increase the amount of geological storage of CO2 versus what it would have been anyway. And meanwhile, the new forest after harvest will start to regrow. So we start to incrementally increase the biogenic storage again in ecosystems, and therefore we increase the total amount of avoided and stored carbon through time. And this repeats and increases cycle by cycle. So the more cycles we have of BECCS, the more strong this effect becomes. So that's really a very positive pathway for very long-term mitigation using BECCS or BECCU type pathways, which really changes the dynamics of some previous criticisms of bioenergy. Now, just to show the importance of BECCS in the context of a cascading value chain from forestry, there was some work done by Ellie Foster some years ago in Bangor University, where she looked at different cascading value chains of harvested forests, and she looked at the total mitigation over 100 years from those harvested forests. So on the left-hand side, we can see graphs that show in the dark green, the sequestration in the forest itself. And you can see it's always a bit lower when we harvest forests compared with when we don't harvest forests. But then we do get this downstream mitigation from carbon storage in wood products, from BECCS in the brick kind of shading here, from fossil fuel substitution and from concrete substitution. Now, depending on the pathway and the context, we can end up with very substantial negative emissions coming from the BECCS component, and that can really contribute massively to the long-term mitigation achieved by commercial forests. And it means that those forests can exceed the mitigation achieved by slower growing semi-natural forests, but also compared with if we didn't harvest those forests and we left those trees in the ground. So BECCS makes an important contribution to increasing the overall mitigation we can achieve. That's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is a rolling average of what this would look like if we planted 30,000 hectares of forest in the UK every year, and we followed the dynamics out to 2120. But we can see here in the yellow, depending on the scenario, this is the BECCS, and the BECCS makes a very important contribution to this total mitigation. But we also see at the global perspective from the IPCC that in most of their scenarios exploring pathways to climate stabilization, we need negative emissions. We're simply off track, a long way off track to reduce our emissions quickly enough to stabilize the climate. So we will need negative emissions, and BECCS seem like they're almost an inevitable part of these negative emissions. It's very hard to envisage any future climate stabilization without some form of BECCS being implemented. Now, the amount of BECCS depends on how quickly we reduce emissions from main sectors of the economy, including industry, energy, agricultural emissions. It depends on the future land use sink that we can achieve through biogenic storage in ecosystems. And it depends on whether other technologies like DACs become scaled in time. But either way, there seems to be a very important role for BECCS in any future climate stabilization scenarios. And we've looked at this a little bit in an Irish context, in the context of carbon budgets and how we get to climate neutrality in Ireland. And we've got two examples here. On the top, we've got an example of biomethane. There's an ambitious biomethane strategy in Ireland, and it's possible that we could link that biomethane strategy with BECCS, with CCS. In the next 15 years or so, it's assumed that the biggest mitigation we can achieve through biomethane is to use it as a transport fuel to substitute diesel because of the prevalence of diesel in the transport sector. And that gives us this quite significant credit, the energy and waste substitution credit that we see here. In time, that might diminish as we electrify transport. So maybe in the 2040s and 2050s, that becomes less important, and it becomes more important to use biomethane in heavy industry or for electricity generation as a flexible fuel. And in that case, if we apply CCS, then we end up with some negative emissions. So we end up with a much smaller mitigation achieved by displacing fossil fuels because we're displacing less fossil fuel. Maybe we're displacing natural gas, which also has CCS. So we've got less displacement benefit, but we have this unique negative emission contribution, which means that we can, and that might increase through time as we increase the deployment rate of CCS. So in these kind of scenarios, we can see that we have a benefit of applying the CCS to the biomethane because we're trying to generate these negative emissions, which will always give a benefit versus any substituted fuels. So that's one example with biomethane and the role that different uses of biomethane through time and in the future linked with CCS could play in decarbonisation and negative emissions. Now on the bottom, we looked at the wood sector extremely tentatively, and we just explored what could happen if we applied BECCS to side streams from forestry, the lower value side streams, but also if we applied CCS to the end of life use of wood. So at the end of a cascade, if we use that wood for bioenergy after it's been used for a product, at the moment it's assumed most of that carbon just oxidizes to the atmosphere at the end of life through the harvested wood product decay function. So we have this loss of biogenic carbon after it's been used in products. But actually much of that biogenic carbon is available in the old products to use as a waste, if you like, as a waste source of energy to go into the bioenergy sector. Big store of biogenic carbon. And in theory, it's carbon to which we could apply CCS and therefore achieve BECCS. Now, if we look at this through time, this is very hypothetical, but in an Irish context, we'd have less substitution coming off the harvests. The funny shape of the line is just the nature of the dynamics of forest harvests in Ireland. But we'd have a diminishing effect of substitution as we decarbonize our concrete sector and other sectors that we displace products from with the wood. But on the other hand, we have this increasing, this orange line is the BECCS contribution, the negative emissions contribution, which steadily increases through time as we continuously harvest and as we ramp up the application of CCS through time. And doing that means we end up with an increasing total negative emissions or emissions mitigation effect from the forestry products. So this is just for the forestry products part of the value chain, excluding the forest growth. And we can see that we can end up with very strong negative emissions through the application of BECCS to those value chains through time. So it could be a very important technology for meeting some of our climate targets. And this all needs to be explored in a bit more detail with more detailed scenarios, but we can see that there's big potential here. So in summary, BECCS is important because we can utilize side streams to generate negative emissions. BECCS fits value added approaches in the circular and cascading bioeconomy because we can apply BECCU or BECCS at the end of life. We can also apply BECCU to capture that CO2 and to recycle it into new products. And so it becomes a fundamental part of a circular or a cascading chain, which can be very important for net zero bioplastics, for example. BECCS value chains also provide some flexibility because a lot of expense goes into the capture of the carbon, the CO2, and we can decide whether we use that CO2, whether we put it into products, whether we put it into second generation fuels, or whether we put it into long-term storage. So after making the investment in that capture technology, it keeps our options open about how we manage that carbon long-term, and we need all the options we have to do that. And it should be said that it's also complementary rather than competition with direct air capture and storage, which is likely to become viable and really sustainable only very long term when we have an abundance of renewable energy that isn't taking renewable energy from displacing it from other useful purposes. So it's really this flexibility and complementarity of BECCS with DACS, I think, highlights how it's almost an inevitable part of any transition towards a climate stabilization or net zero future. So that's it for my side. I hope I haven't gone over time, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dave, for your excellent input and no overtime. Thank you for this. So this brings us to the next speaker and actually the first case study input. On this, we have Karin Pettersson here. She is senior researcher at RISE, the Research Institutes of Sweden, and where she is coordinating the BECCS and BECCU area. And Karin is also the Swedish NTL to our Task 40 and member of Task 40. And Karin is presenting the case study on Sweden with the focus on BECCS and BECCU. And Karin is also giving some overview on the EU, so the EU regulation and perspective with BECCS and BECCU. Thank you, Karin.
Thank you, Christiane, for that introduction. And I hope everyone can see my sharing of slides.
Yes, it's visible all there. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yes, so first, before going into Sweden, as Christiane said, something short about the EU level and things that are affecting BECCUS to different extent. So EU should be climate neutral in 2050. And earlier this year, as a start of the 2040 negotiation, the Commission presented a suggestion for a net 90% reduction to 2040. And in scenarios by the European Commission, capture of biogenic or atmospheric CO2 is estimated to contribute with up to almost 500 million tons per year in 2050. We also have the carbon removal certification framework, which shall then contribute to ensure high quality of measures for carbon storage. And this will be voluntary, at least initially, but the ambition is to become the sort of governing body in the long term and be used in both in trading of certificates on the voluntary market and in other private as well as sort of public funding of carbon sinks. In connection to this suggestion for 2040 goals, the Commission also introduced the EU Industrial Carbon Management Strategy, which will sort of complement existing policy and financial instruments at EU level, focusing on CCUS. And one of the next steps here is to negotiate and decide where to report permanent negative emissions for BECCS or DACs. And here EU ETS is one option, and it's also listed in the carbon management strategy, which will also then sort of create economic incentives for BECCS, since there will be a price on negative emission credits through the EU ETS. If it's, on the other hand, placed in one of the other regulations, I mean, other policies on EU level and or national level will have to be created in order to create long-term economic incentives for BECCS and also, of course, other measures for permanent negative emissions. For CCU and electrofuels, last year, the Refuel e-Aviation and also the Fuel EU Maritime was presented, which will create incentives for renewable fuels in aviation maritime sector with special sub-quotas also for electrofuels, especially within the Refuel e-Aviation. And this will, of course, create a market for electrofuels. And within RED, the Renewable Energy Directive, there is also delegated acts that have been implemented with sustainability criteria for electrofuels. For example, setting a sort of a stop year for using fossil CO2, and also requirements on the electricity used to generate these fuels. Yeah, that was short about the EU level. So now I'm going into Sweden. Sweden should be climate neutral in 2045. So it's 5 years earlier than the EU, and with at least 85% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And more than 4 years ago, a governmental investigation was presented, the pathway to a climate positive future. And in that one, we have sort of indicative goals for the need for measures to compensate for residual emissions in 2045. And we had a quantification of that, and BECCS is estimated to contribute with up to 10 million tons of CO2 per year in 2045. And at this point also, negative emission through BECCS became a part of a big national program for research and innovation, which has, for example, made it possible to get funding for feasibility studies and the type of projects and research regarding BECCS. And there was also a decision to investigate a support scheme for BECCS in Sweden, and I will come back to this. And when it comes to storage, it is Denmark and Norway that actors with plans in near-term future are looking at. And Sweden has recently signed cooperation agreements on storage with both these countries. But we also have ongoing investigations of suitable locations for permanent storage of CO2 in Sweden. But this will not be available in near-term future. It's more in the long-term perspective. If we look at the business models for actors in the near-term future, it's often based on a combination of state support, this support scheme, and that I will talk more about, and also then in combination with selling credits on the voluntary carbon market. And in Sweden, as well as I know also internationally and in other countries, there has been a huge discussion around the design of this support scheme and also then the claims for negative emissions. So is it a problem that a state and a company claim the same negative emissions, what we call double claiming or co-claiming? And here there are very different positions. I will also come back to this later. So in Sweden, there are many plans and activities regarding BECCUS. We have more than, I think, 30 different plants which have looked in both in the heat and power sector and the pulp and paper industry that have to different extent looked into the possibility of implementing BECCS, and many then with support from this research and innovation program. For CCU, there are currently 9 different announcements, I think, of efforts regarding future implementation of large-scale CCU, and it's mainly focused on aviation fuels and also methanol for the maritime sector. And there's also, in addition, some companies have looked into the CCU to some extent in connection with CCS investigations. And for BECCS, focus on that first, Stockholm Exergi has been the main actor for many years now in Sweden. They started their efforts already back in 2015 or 16, I think. And they plan for a facility that can capture 800 tons of CO2 each year at one of their combined heat and power plants in Stockholm. And they were granted support from the EU Innovation Fund in 2021. And they have closed deals with different companies regarding permanent carbon removals. And the latest one and the largest one, not just for Stockholm BECCS, but also if you look at it worldwide, is the affair with Microsoft this spring. But I should emphasize here that there are no investment decision taken yet. They are waiting for the Swedish support scheme to come into place. So if we go over to the support scheme that I mentioned a few times, it is in the form of reversed auctions, and it's funded then through the state budget, where 36 billion Swedish crowns has been allocated for between 2026 and 2046. And it's been announced that 1 to 3 auctions will be held, and the first one hopefully during 2024. And now finally notification of state aid has been submitted to the European Commission, so it's for final approval of the support scheme. There will be 15-year contracts. Otherwise, the details of the final design of the support scheme is still unknown. So we don't know whether it will be possible to combine this with financing for the voluntary carbon market, or how it will be designed exactly. So if this scheme would finance BECCS plants by itself, so to say, it will be enough to finance storage of 800,000 tons of CO2 for 15 years. If, on the other hand, then you can combine it with, say, 50% financing from the voluntary carbon market, of course, then you can double the amount of CO2 that you can capture. And in contrast to BECCS, where we then do not have any investment decision yet in Sweden, there is a plant under construction for e-methanol production in Örnsköldsvik in the northern part of Sweden. It's a product developed by the company Liquid Wind, but was then acquired by the Danish company Ørsted, who took the final investment decision. So in 2025, production of 50,000 tons of methanol for the maritime sector will be produced each year. And I mean, this facility, as well as other initiatives, are mainly driven by the quotas and goals in the maritime and aviation sector. And also one of the reasons for choosing Sweden, and especially the northern parts, are, of course, good access to biogenic CO2, but not the least also to renewable electricity, also if one uses grid electricity. So in Sweden, we recently conducted a strategy for BECCUS, which was presented and handed over to the government in May this year by Fossil Free Sweden. And Fossil Free Sweden is an initiative by the Swedish government, so it's not the government's own strategy, I should emphasize that, because Fossil Free Sweden work independently with roadmaps and strategies to accelerate the transition to a fossil-free Sweden. And the main output from this strategy, who was developed in dialogue and also signed with many of the key companies and actors related to BECCUS in Sweden, is an action plan for the Swedish government related to this area. And some important starting points for the strategy. Of course, I should have emphasized this maybe earlier, but Sweden has, large biogenic emission point sources, more than 32 million tons per year, if you count the ones larger than 100,000 tons per year. And we have a great potential for increased carbon utilization, and also to eventually become a significant net exporter of both sustainable carbon-based products, fuels, chemicals, materials, and also negative emissions. And another important starting point for this strategy was that to actually reach the sort of net negative phase where we actually decrease the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. In order for this to happen, we cannot just use negative emission for compensation of residual emissions. So therefore, it is important to be sort of restrictive in the use of negative emission to only compensate for emissions that are difficult or very expensive to remove. And for the production of sustainable carbon-based product, a broader perspective than pure CCU must be adopted. There are more efficient solutions than pure CCU for most applications, for example, than producing fuels directly from biomass with strong electrification. So finally, some examples from the action plan, and first related to BECCS. And the strategy sort of strived hard to find a compromise in this question regarding the sort of design of the support scheme and double claims. And it was that the support scheme should be able to be combined with financing from companies on the voluntary carbon market, because this is a way to sort of use governmental funding as an efficient way as a leverage. And it also then includes an acceptance of co-claiming or double claims to a certain extent, but with some strong recommendation, including pointing out like a recommended lower limit in terms of percentage for private finance in case you combine these two sources of financing, because in this way it is avoided that large amount of negative emissions sort of are credited by companies on the voluntary market in relation to how large percentage they have been involved in financing. But it's also a recommendation how Sweden should use it, to only use this negative emission to compensate for residual emission as we envision them in 2045, so that the sort of pace of continuing emission reductions does not decrease. Can also say, to put this in an international perspective, that this acceptance of double claims is a contrast to some other countries, including, for example, Belgium, France, and Germany, who during COP28 last year signed a joint statement including that double claims should be avoided. Another suggestion is regarding the reporting then of negative emission and the upcoming negotiations within the EU regarding this, and that is to sort of contribute to ensure that this that these negative emissions contribute to an increase in ambition in climate work, regardless of which regulation they are placed in. So it does not replace emission reductions, which could be the case if you don't make adjustment of ETS or ESR, or replace natural sinks, which could be the case in LULUCF. Something that was also discussed a lot during this strategy work was separate goals, which is also a recommendation from the strategy to have both an EU and national level for then emission reduction and carbon storage as a way then to reduce the risk of this replacement negative emissions to emission reductions. So finally then, some example also related mainly to CCU. And from a Swedish perspective, we have mainly policies steering towards usage then of renewable fuels in the transport sector, which has led us to be a significant net importer of biofuels and also raw material for biofuels. So this strategy, as well as other investigation, point out the need for policy instruments that support domestic production also of renewable fuels, including then electrofuels. And currently also the incentives for increased material efficiency and also renewable raw material for chemical and plastics are lacking. So the strategy highlights that Sweden, as other countries are also doing, should push for targets for recycled and renewable raw material for chemical and plastics products within the EU, as well as then introducing a cutoff year like the one we have in the Renewable Energy Directive, for example, then 2040 for intake of new fossil raw materials. And finally, to give recycled carbon atoms sort of a clearer place in waste policy so that the most energy and resource efficient circulation is rewarded when possible. But I mean, at the same time, there also need to be incentives to recycle carbon atoms through CCU, which is sort of the lowest on the waste ladder, since it's sort of based on waste incineration. But in cases where you actually need to combust and not recycle higher up on the ladder, this needs to be promoted, that you also recycle carbon atoms through CCU. That was it for me. Thank you,
Karin, for this excellent overview on Sweden, and also on presenting some insights on the EU. I just wanted to share some info. I received it already in the chat and also in the questions, because I think there's a lot of information that is shared here, and also a lot of information on the slides. So the slides and the recording are going to be shared afterwards. So you will receive that there. Okay, so this brings us from the Swedish case to another case. We have here now the case on the Netherlands, and here we have Jens Voorman with us. He is from the energy company RWE Generation SE, where he is head of strategic development BECCS. And Jens is going to present some activity happening in the Netherlands, and here mainly related to a BECCUS project that was launched in 2022 with the Amber and Ems power plants. So thank you, Jens, that you're with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Christiane. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Well, thanks a lot, and yeah, thanks for having me and to talk about our BECCS projects that we have in the Netherlands. Maybe for those of you who don't know us, RWE as a company, yeah, we are actually one of the biggest utilities in Europe, and being one of the biggest utilities in Europe, we come from a history where, of course, most of that was fossil fired, right? So being fossil fired also means that we're not only one of the biggest utilities in Europe, but we also used to be one of the biggest emitters of CO2. And now we have come up with a very ambitious sustainability strategy, which is, we call it growing green, and which means that coming from being one of the biggest emitters, that we're going into being CO2 neutral in 2040, but this at the same time while still growing a lot. The backbone of that is our renewables fleet. We have a vast renewables fleet already, and the renewables, we call these the working horses of the energy transition. However, it's not the only thing you need. And over here, I just put down the ambition, which is 2.5 gigawatts of capacity expansion every year, mainly in renewable, like offshore wind and solar. Then we have a development pipeline of total of 55 gigawatts of projects. And by 2030, we want to have 50 gigawatts of sustainable capacity in operation. This all we back up with investments of 55 billion euros that we will be or will have spent by 2030 for this huge transition and step to take. And what I just said is just, well, the renewables, offshore wind, solar, being the working horses of the energy transition, we believe, and it's not only us, but of course we are listening a lot to IEA, the IPCC, and all the other experts around there, is that you need huge deployment of negative emissions to be able, as a society, to really get to the point where you're at zero. Because of course, obviously, it's not only the electricity sector that needs to be neutral, but it's also the entire society that needs to be carbon neutral. And there's the hard to abate sectors that, of course, need support in this. What I brought here for you is, well, the chart on the left-hand side is the Netherlands as an example. Same as Sweden, same as Denmark, same as all the other countries in the European Union. Of course, also the Netherlands have bought into and promised that by 2030, as compared to the baseline in 1990, we will have gone down by 55% of our carbon emissions. If we look at it, that means that, well, in 1990, it was roughly 220 megatons of CO2 emitted in the Netherlands per year. And, well, within 30 years, roughly, by 2022, that's where the number come from, it's been down to 150 million. However, to reach the targets, which is only an intermediate milestone on the way to neutrality, in 2030, Netherlands, well, we need to be at roughly 100 megatons per year of emissions. So that means where right now, in the last 34 years, actually, we were able to reduce roughly 70 million tons per year. Now, in the next 6 years to come, we need to go down another 50 million to 60 million tons, depending on what the target is, because the government has even stated that they want to get to minus 60% and not only 55%, just to be on the safe side. But what you do see is there's a current estimate in there, and this estimate is from from PBL in the Netherlands, and it's all about, there's a lot of policies that's in place. For example, coal-fired power stations going out of operations, and there's a lot of commitments, like voluntary commitments out there. Now there's been a lot of measures that have been taken to reach the targets in 2030. However, we still believe that there is quite a gap that needs to be filled up by 2030. And this again brings me to both our past but also our future, because on the left-hand side you can see I put our Eemshaven power station and also our Amer power station. These are the ones that are really the most matured cases that we have for BECCS, is that coming from being big emitters, because they used to be coal-fired power stations, is that now we have a big advantage, which is these power stations can be converted into basically the biggest negative emission assets there are in Europe. And once you can do that, you're part of the solution, because if you look at it, Eemshaven alone can deliver 8 to 10 million tons of negative emissions a year once fully converted to BECCS. Amer can do another 3 to 4 million tons of CO2 negative emissions per year. And we have a couple of smaller projects. So all roughly 15 million tons that we could throw into the mix by 2030 and help the Netherlands significantly to reach the milestones, and of course after also on the way to real neutrality. And this interacts and aligns nicely with our ambition as a company, and that's the graph on the right-hand side that you see. And that's the transformation of our conventional generation portfolio, because what you do see is that also in the future, even with renewables being the workhorses of the energy transition, we of course do need the firm and the flex capacities to be able to balance the grid and to be able to also make sure that we provide also at moments where we have the so-called Dunkelflaute, so no wind, no sun, but also making sure that we diversify, that we're not fully reliant, for example, on gas and others. And this is where we need a conventional fleet still, one that is firm and flex. What you can see in the dark blue bars is us as RWE. If we wouldn't take any action, but only live through maybe the end of lifetime moments of our power stations, and then by 2040 we would still be net emitting. However, we have put together a decarbonization roadmap that includes, of course, massive buildup of renewables, but at the same time also, decarbonization of our gas fleet and even negative emissions of our Amer and Eemshaven power station. What you can see is that, after 2030 and 2035, as a company, we would even become carbon negative, which would even be increased by 2040. And by this helping other sectors who have hard to abate parts to also get to a point where they can be neutral. I brought these two slides of Eemshaven and Amer just to show where they are located in the Netherlands. And what you can see is that both power stations are actually located in perfect positions actually to do these steps, which is Eemshaven all the way in the north with a deep sea harbor. And this is where, of course, you can develop quite some shipping opportunities to ship out either in the Dutch North Sea, but also the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Norway for storage, but also for utilization. And also quite close to that power station, we have quite a large industrial center, that's Delfzijl, where also there's quite some innovative products that's being developed also in the CCU world. So Eemshaven perfectly located for that, also able to deliver heat to surrounding factories. And then we have Amer all the way in the south. It is landlocked, however, in a very good position. Why is it a good position? Well, because it is still quite close to Rotterdam and the industrial center over there. So also the planned infrastructure for this is going to come close to our power station over there. And as you might know, is that in the Netherlands, out of Rotterdam, Portos Aramis, these are very mature projects. Portos under construction already to develop the first real storage network in the Netherlands. So Amer in a very good position to tap into that and also support the heating network around our power station. I'm sure I don't need to explain the full value chain of BECCS, but still I put it in here. Why did I put it in here? Again, this is because it has a lot to do with a change of a mindset, also within our company, but also I think in the public, which is to understand that we really have gold in hands here. A lot of times when we talk about CO2, people already stop listening and they go like, oh yeah, CO2, we need to get rid of it, as in close the plant down. However, the moment where it's of course biogenic CO2 that comes from a sustainable biomass source, ideally starting from the left, going into, for example, biorefining, which means cascading that biomass so that we really go through all the value steps and value increasing steps, and then put it into our power station, is really a valuable product. Because it will produce then sustainable electricity and heat, it will provide CO2-free flex power. And also, of course, once we have captured that CO2, we can either ship into storage. That's in the beginning, at least, going to be the majority of the production. But also, of course, us also being in the especially renewables business with wind and solar, the intermittent non-flex green electricity, we're also in the business of making hydrogen of it. If you have green CO2, green hydrogen, and then some green electrons, all bringing it together, you can make e-fuels, e-chemicals, but also innovative topics like future plastics or whatever society needs. And this is where we really see the big benefit of really making it an value add for the society. Coming here maybe to my conclusion, and also I was asked to talk a little bit about the challenges that we face. And for those of you at least who are from the Netherlands, you probably know that the public and also politicians in the Netherlands are quite critical of biomass. We see that and we understand it because in the past, biomass was mainly a subsidy story. Yeah? So a subsidy story is never a good story, especially not if it's only a subsidy story where people can also shoot holes in making a point as in, oh, it's not even helping us. That was in the past biomass for electricity production only. The easiest argument was always, yes, but solar and wind can do the same thing. And if they can do it without burning anything, why would we be subsidizing biomass that might even be more expensive and then having problems to sometimes even prove that it is really sustainable and helping us? That's what built kind of a negative sphere in the Netherlands, because then also, of course, tax money was put into it to help large utilities like us to make it a case. But that's, of course, where this comes from. In the end, what of course really is that biomass will deliver something also in the electricity generation business that wind and solar cannot deliver. And that's of course the firm flex, but especially the negative emissions. And if you look at that, and that's the second bullet here, the negative emissions or carbon dioxide removals, they are so far not fully recognized yet as a high value product, which is a problem for us because sometimes we do face the argument, hey, if green CO2 is worth so much, what a waste that you store it underground. So basically, as if we would just deposit it off, you should put it to good use. And don't get me wrong, we are also growing the CCU business, so we are very much pro CCU. The only thing we see is it will take longer for the CCU to develop because it also needs massive build out of renewables, massive build out of especially the hydrogen economy. So that will need some time. But it's never a waste to put it underground because the fact that the biogenic CO2 has been taken from the air and put it underground, that is the high value product. The next step, of course, is the voluntary markets. We find this very attractive, but at the moment, of course, the voluntary market is still rather small. And at the same time, and thanks for talking about the EU perspective in this, of course, the compliance market is underway, but it's yet to come. So we're hoping to see that there will be decisions made in 2026 with potentially the compliance market coming into operation, maybe 2030, 2031, maybe later. So right now it is a little bit tough to place decisions, of course, on a to-come development. So what we really see is that we need to see these markets ramp up and also get some incentives for that. And then, of course, also both for the carbon dioxide removals, but also for the cross-border CO2 transport, there's still a lack of regulation at points. So there's a lot of MOUs out there. There's a lot of bilateral meetings between countries like Norway and the Netherlands recently, where, basically memorandums are being signed to say, yes, we need it and we want to enable it, but still there's a lot to come. so much of the, say, development areas, but it's not only negative topics, of course. But what we do see in the Netherlands is the Dutch government, I mean, it's the outgoing Dutch government, but well, okay, we'll take it. The outgoing Dutch government has set a target for carbon dioxide removals in the energy business of 1.5 megatons of CO2 a year by 2030. Well, this is still small, but it's a first step in a good direction. They have recognized the need of negative emissions in the portfolio to reach the targets. At the same time, the parliament in the Netherlands has asked the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate to develop a roadmap for negative emissions. It is through the re-elections in the Netherlands right now a little bit postponed, but we expect it to be published somewhere at the end of this year or early next year. And we expect also that the roadmap for negative emissions will outline more ambitious targets of how big should that role be and how will it contribute, but also how will it be supported and incentivized. Recently, in the Netherlands, PBL, they advised the government and they have recommended to open up the Dutch Sustainable Energy Subsidy scheme that is called the SDE++, open it for CCS in the energy sector. And that is, of course, made to also enable BECCS in the energy sector to be able to have a case in which you can earn money or at least get to black zero. And there is, of course, in the ST++ already right now a category that offers contracts for difference for CCU in the greenhouses already, because in the Netherlands, of course, the greenhouse business is quite large and they do need CO2 in their greenhouses to help all the plants to grow faster. This originally is being taken from fossil fuels, gas engines, basically, or gas turbines, which of course has quite a CO2 footprint. If you could already remove that, or not remove, but replace that with biogenic, that would be, of course, a huge help already. And maybe last but not least, TenneT, that is the Dutch grid service, they have analyzed the Dutch grid, and they clearly said the grid needs attention for firm flex after 2030. So if you put that all together and you see what has happened with security of supply, prices in the past, a huge bill of renewables, and we need to firm flex on that. It needs to be still affordable, and it needs to be a huge deployment of negative emission in the market. This all brings me to the point in my conclusion where we say BECCS can be a part of the solution, offering the cost competitive firm flex electricity generation and at the same time carbon dioxide removals at a significant scale, which for us as RWE is roughly in the area of 15 million tons a year. Thanks.
Many thanks, Jens, for giving this insight from a utility provider, and also for joining here then as an external speaker to this IEA BioEnergy webinar. And it's really great that you also had this summarizing slide at the end. And I think this will be something we will discuss a little more then later in the Q&A. Thank you for now. So this brings me to Christian Bang, our next speaker. So moving from Sweden to the Netherlands back to Scandinavia. Christian will bring us some insights now on the Danish activities in BECCS and BECCU. He is a senior consultant and financial director at EA Energy Analysis in Denmark. And he is also a Danish NTL to our Task 40 and is dealing with BECCS and BECCU on a daily basis, both within our IEA BioEnergy work, but also in the Danish context, where he also consults different projects on planning BECCS activities. So, Christian, great for having you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the intro. Just double checking, everyone can see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes, seeing your slides, seeing you okay.
Great. All right. Okay, are you still seeing the deployment in Denmark slide there?
Yes, it's still the deployment in Denmark slide.
Yeah, just having some problems going to the next slide here.
Now you...
Here we go.
Now on the next slide, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so I've tried to highlight some of the lot of the things that have been going on in Denmark the last 4 or 5 years. And I've given time constraints today, we'll try to narrow in on some of the most important. So if we start with in 2020, the Danish government adopted the Climate Act, which is set a target for 70% emission reductions relative to 1990 by 2030, and climate neutrality by 2050, a phrase we're hearing a few times today. And in order to reach these targets, the Danish government realized that they're going to have to rely quite significantly on CCS. So at the same time, or the same year, a little later during the year, they established this market-based CCUS fund, as they called it, and they earmarked roughly 2 billion euros in funding to help achieve these targets. At the time, it was thought it would be it take place via kind of 2 tenders, one that would be undertaken in 2023, and another one to at a later date. And then if we fast forward a couple of years to May of 22, the Danish Energy Agency, the DEA, they launched the first of these tenders with roughly a max 1 billion euros in funding. And the idea was to achieve emission reductions of 400,000 tons a year annually by 2026. And this could be biogenic or fossil CO2. And also later that year, in August of 2022, the Danish Energy Agency, they launched the first tender for exploration permits for potential offshore storage of CO2 in the Danish portion of the North Sea. And then again, if we fast forward a little bit, there was quite a few things that happened last year, but I'll focus on the last one here and actually get back to some of the other elements in my upcoming slides. But in December of 23, the DA launched the first licensing round in Europe for full-scale onshore licenses for exploration and potential storage of CO2. And there was 5 distinct sites that they designated. And also I'll get back to this slide regarding some more specifics as well. So if we look at some of the main aspects, one of them is large-scale capture. And as I mentioned, there was a bidding round opened up in May of 22, and then the winner was announced of May of 23. And it was Ørsted's Kalundborg Hub project that won that bidding round. And they will be capturing and sequestering 430,000 tons of biogenic CO2 annually, starting in 2026. They'll be doing this from 2 different sites. If you look down here on the right, we have the Averø power station. It's in eastern Denmark. And then we also have, and that's the unit there where carbon capture will be applied is based on straw. And then there's the Esnes power station, which is a little further west and over here. And there it's a wood chip fired unit where they'll apply carbon capture. And so the CO2 we transferred from Averø to Esnes, and then it will be loaded onto ships, specially designed ships owned and operated by Northern Lights, where it'll be transferred up to Norway and then sequestered at their sequestration site a little over 2.5 kilometers under the Norwegian portion of the North Sea. And in terms of the technology providers, Aker Carbon Capture will provide the CO2 capture, compression, and liquefaction technology at both sites. And last but certainly not least, we've also heard this name mentioned before, is Microsoft. They're involved in the project as they are purchasing the carbon removal certificates, i.e. the negative emissions generated by the project. So that's helping lift the financial burden in addition to the 20-year subsidy that the project's receiving from the Danish Energy Agency. And I mentioned there would also be some upcoming bidding rounds. There's 2 more the CCS bidding rounds scheduled. One is meant to be made public fairly soon. Initially, it was discussed June of 24. And the goal here is to achieve CO2 emission reductions of 900,000 tons via carbon capture. And then another one is meant to be launched in June of 25, and here the goal was 1.4 million tons of CO2. There's a slight change to the subsidy period. It's been shortened to 15 years. And as it stands now, I mean, it's not public, but what they've been stating in advance is that the subsidies will be available from 2028, but in order to qualify, the projects have to be fully up and running by 2029. And an interesting aspect of these bids, the way it's likely to be designed, is that the winner of the bid may opt out after 2030 if they can find a more economic way to use the CO2. So it's essentially shifting from CCS to CCUS. Now, if we look at some of the storage activities in Denmark, as I mentioned, there was a licensing round for offshore storage announced in 2022, and the winners were announced in February of 2023. And here there was 3 exclusive licenses for exploration and full-scale storage that were issued. 2 to Total, and you see that's indicated by the 2 red portions of the figure here. And then 1 to a consortium consisting of INEOS and Wintershall. That's the light blue portion here. And so these licenses cover areas that have depleted oil and gas wells, as well as wells suited yet to be investigated geographical areas. And the timing and design of the storage facilities will depend on these exploration operations and the analysis they undertake. And any specific storage project will first have to be approved by the Danish Energy Agency. And the idea here is the CO2 will be transported either via special purpose ships or through existing or new pipelines. And the reason I say new or existing is there's actually 2 pipelines that go from the western portion of Denmark out to the oil and gas fields today. And it potentially one of these could be retrofitted to transport CO2 as opposed to sending natural gas the other way. Now, in terms of projects on the go right now, one is Project Greensand. It's currently in the pilot phase. It's in the Nini oil field. This is part of the blue portion of the figure here. They're scheduled to make a financial investment decision for a full-scale project sometime during this year. And if this comes to fruition, by 25, 26, it's estimated they could sequester 1.5 million tons a year. And this could be potentially scaled up to 8 million tons a year by 2030. There's 23 partners in this consortium that's led by INEOS and Wintershall. This currently pilot phase project is supported by the Danish state via the Energy Technology Development Demonstration Program, or EUDP. There's also another project underway, a development and demonstration project called Bifrost. And here they're investigating the potential for storage in Harald West. It's a depleted gas field. As far as I can ascertain, it's in the light red box here. And here the storage capacity is estimated at several million tons a year. And the partners include Total, DTU Offshore. DTU is the Danish Technical University, DTU Management, Nordsøfonden, and Blue Nord. And this project is also supported by the Danish state via this EUDP. Yeah, in terms of onshore CO2 storage, as I mentioned, the licensing round was opened in December of last year, and the deadline was January of this year. What they opened up for was subsurface exploration of potential sites at 5 specific sites, 2 in Jutland, Gessum and Torning, and then the 3 remaining at Havnsø, Stenlille, and then the southernmost here, Røby. And the idea is these exploration licenses will be granted for up to 6 years, with the potentially being extended to 10 years. And if the area fulfills all the environmental requirements and is deemed suitable for CO2 storage, then the licensees can apply for a storage license, where they'd have the right to store CO2 for up to 30 years. Actually, I should have mentioned this for some of the other projects, and this is the case with these projects, is the Danish state via the Onshore Fund is going to participate with a 20% ownership share. And there was 8 bids received for these 5 sites. The DA didn't publicize which they bid on, but so there was 9 companies altogether, because some bids had more than one company on these 8 sites, and the winners should be announced any day now. I actually been hoping we might be able to have a slide with the winners today, but that wasn't the case. And it's assumed that once these onshore bidding rounds have been finalized, that the applications for 3 nearshore areas will be opened up. This is awaiting a maritime spatial plan, but many of the same conditions will apply to these nearshore storage sites as they did for the onshore, just taking into account the regulations for offshore storage. So then one of the quick questions one would want to ask is then, okay, can we couple these bidding rounds, the new bidding rounds coming up, with storage in Denmark? And in terms of coupling the onshore storage with the bidding rounds for 24 and 25, this could be difficult. That's to say that even if the onshore storage can be online in 2029, it's unlikely that these potential storage providers are willing to enter into contracts already in 24 or 25 or maybe 26, depending on when the bidders have to submit their final bids. So this misalignment could potentially result in some of the CCS bidders 24 and 25 having to rely on more costly offshore solutions and or locking into these costly solutions for a longer period of time. So while the 2 next large CCS projects in Denmark may end up going offshore, longer term, I think onshore storage is going to be a very cost-effective option within Denmark, both for Danish projects, but also for other European countries looking to export CO2. And as we've heard from some of the previous speakers, there's been some memorandums of understanding signed between various countries. Yeah, so last, if we look at some of the key takeaways for Denmark, CCUS is definitely driven by the Danish climate targets, in particular the 2030 targets. And recently we've seen this kind of shift from CCUS to CCS. Some of the same actors we've been talking with 2 or 3 years ago were looking at CCU, are now looking at CCS. And I think one of the reasons is that CCS provides this very cost-effective option to meet the 2030 targets, excuse me. And you could also argue that this is related to the Danish government's desire to become a CO2 storage option for other European countries. And it's also important to note that there's national, regional, municipal governments, as well as private companies that require what we define as high-quality negative emissions in order to meet their climate targets. And this provides a very strong willingness to pay from both governments via subsidies and also companies via these negative emission credits for biogenic-based CCS. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, and I'll turn it back to you, Christian.
Thank you, Christian, for having this wonderful overview on Denmark. And I think with a lot of information to digest, as I think at the moment, as so many things are happening, not only in Denmark, but also in other countries that are looking into BECCS and BECCU. So this is also what we are in general seeing, that in the last months, several governments are coming up with strategies on negative emissions or other CCS or CCU in general strategies. So things are moving and many things are happening same time. So I think this is also kind of a reason why also our information is maybe a lot that we want to share. So later on, you also have the opportunity to have a closer look into the slides. So this brings us to the Q&A session. Thank you to the speakers. Our time management is excellent. And we received some of your questions from the audience, of course, in the Q&A. So thank you for this. Some of them we already were answering while the webinar was running. But some of them we also want to have here with you as a question we want to explore further and also get a feedback directly from the speakers. So we would start with something that was raised at the beginning for the presentation of Dave. And here the question reads, what about CO2 capture by anaerobic digestion and its utilization? As its utilization will be a problem for climate change, so what would it mean? So this is a question that was raised, and I would ask Dave to reflect on this.
Okay, thanks, Christian, and thanks for the question. So yeah, there is a trade-off between permanently storing the biogenic carbon versus using it. And using it, you can displace another fossil fuel potentially, but you ultimately still release that biogenic CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's where there are choices. And I think the choices depend on the design of the value chains and how you integrate the BECCUS technology. I think, as Karen mentioned, BECCU is maybe a lower priority in the hierarchy. First, we should try to use biomass resources as well as we can. We need to cascade biomass as effectively as we can. CCU is quite expensive, so maybe we only use it at the end. Biomethane in general is not the most efficient use of land for converting for energy generation either, because of the conversion process, and we have different CO2 streams to capture, which is messy. So in essence, I think we need to integrate the BECCUS in a strategic way into cascading value chains, and that might include biorefineries. I think anaerobic digestion is a very good technology for biorefineries, and that's where we can add value to biomass and products, and we end up with side streams. So yes, there are trade-offs between storing versus using the biogenic CO2, and always we should try to maximize the value of the biomass upstream as far as we can before utilizing it. So I suppose there's no one answer, but that's a few reflections on that point. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave, for this input. If any of the speakers would like to reflect on any of the statements, just raise your hand and we can have this also at the same time. So just let me know. Otherwise, then we would move on to one of the next questions. And here it's really a question about deployment. So really happy to see that. So there's a question. I'm wondering if there are examples of trials demonstrating BECCS working effectively, particularly with woody biomass. So, and here I would like to ask Karin, maybe first to answer this question, and also would be great from Christian to have maybe some supportive input here, as I think Denmark is also very prominent in using woody biomass.
Yes, I mean, I can mention one example. Stockholm BECCS, as I mentioned, have a pilot facility that they have operated since 2019, and it's it's connected to the biomass power plant. It's rather small, but it has sort of been the basis for the planned upscaling at Stockholm BECCS. So that's one example. I know that there are other pilot facility also coming into place connected to other plants in Sweden. But I can hand it over to you, Christian, now to say something about Danish example.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have any information I can share with that in terms of pilot projects here. Sorry.
Maybe just one point on that. I think right now you don't see so many, say, really large-scale BECCS plants in operation. So with biogenic, so wood pellet use and the combination of CCS. However, both technologies that you combine here are obviously, of course, proven in the market already for a long, long time. There is large-scale CCS installations out there, the biggest being almost 2 million tons a year. That is in combination with a fossil-fired power station in the United States and in Canada. However, of course, we ourselves and many others in Denmark, Sweden, and other places, of course, have been converting power stations from coal to biomass, though. So our Armor power station is currently pretty much 100%. Will be on 100% end of the year. We've had our Tilbury power station, many others. So both technologies separately are very proven state-of-the-art technology. Just a combination of both has so far, I think, not been demonstrated in that way, just simply also because also the negative emissions in the past have not been incentivized in a way that now, through the whole debate and showcasing it around the IPCC, how much negative emissions need to be deployed, that in that combination, it would have been there at that stage.
Yeah, thank you, Jens, for this input. And I just can summarize and agree to this. So as Jens stated, it's the technology readiness level and also market readiness levels are quite high then. And it's rather like a question of actually combining them then in real demonstrating level. And yeah, let's hope that we have something end of 2025, beginning of 2026, somewhere coming up, so that we can really see maybe a first demonstration on that kind. In relation to this question, there was just one remark again in the chat. So back to you, Karin, from the audience. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't catch the name of the specific plant in Sweden that you were referring to.
Yeah, it's Stockholm Exergi and the plant I mentioned in Värtan in Stockholm. I can also provide a link maybe here in the chat describing yeah, the pilot facility and also other things connected to their BECCS project.
Oh, that would be really great. Thank you, Karin. And both of the plants that also are projects also that Karin mentioned are also part of the slides. So you can also see them there. Okay, super. Then we just have another question for Jens. And here it reads, how do you expect the new coalition Dutch government to affect the BECCUS plans? Also, do you expect more details on BECCUS to be published by the government anytime soon? I think this is a very interesting question, and many are curious on your feedback on this.
Well, the last question I can answer quite quickly. I don't expect a lot on BECCS soon. I think they will need some time. Maybe just not, I believe not everybody follows the Dutch politics. So there has been a re-election, there's a new coalition in place where there's three, a little bit more, say, right-wing parties and the Liberal Party of the former Premier who now form the coalition together, where actually 3 out of the 4 parties are critical of biomass. And in the first headline coalition program, they stated that they wanted to follow, it's a little bit of a cryptical sentence, that's why I'm trying to rephrase it also in English, where they said that they are going to follow through with the roadmap that the former government has started, which is exiting subsidies for biomass also in BECCS. Which is interesting because, to my understanding, there is so far no subsidizing in BECCS, but it's not really news in that way that we know in the Netherlands there's biomass subsidies out there. These like public is very critical of the politicians are as well. To my knowledge, the last subsidies in the Netherlands will run out in 2027, also on our power stations. And already for a couple of years, it's very clear that there will not be any new subsidies on biomass. Not on biomass, just to simply generate electricity. However, the same coalition in the Netherlands, they also stated that they think that CCS is a very important technology because it's all about still having affordable electricity, affordable products, keeping the industry here. So they are setting in on CCS. And at the same time, not going into subsidizing biomass, but not subsidizing biomass doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with BECCS, because also so far they have not said anything about negative emissions. So at the moment, there's still the target of the government that is out there, which is 1.5 million tons a year in 2030, and also the parliament asking for the roadmap of negative emissions to be developed. But right now, actually, the minister has just been announced who's going to be the responsible minister. Maybe as a last word on that, what we hear is that these ministers now also need to get up to speed. Once they've been also officially announced over the summertime, they will need to work on their budgets because in September there's Prinsjesdag, which means they need to announce the budget for the next year. And most probably only after that, they will really start detailing their politics.
Super. Thank you, Jens, for this. And just as a general information, also another question that was raised to Jens was about what would be an appropriate price level to incentivize BECCS in the Netherlands. Jens already reflected on this in the chat itself, but also feel free to share 1 or 2 sentences on this again to the audience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I already stated, like, I can of course not share any commercial information here, but what I can say is though that you see, of course, in the voluntary carbon market, you see a couple of deals being closed right now. Sometimes they do tell you what the pricing is, sometimes they don't. The pricings that we do hear from the voluntary markets are in the range that would make BECCS possible. So, I mean, there's different pricings, and maybe there's also then something about direct air capture. There are a lot of fans out there for direct air capture. And just let me state this also and get this right. I'm also a big fan of direct air capture. It will all need to be there. We need all the options on the table, not only on the table, but also be developed. However, right now, and you see this reflected in the pricing in the voluntary markets, a ton of CO2 negative emissions from a direct air capture plant is probably between, give a very wide range, between 800 and 1400 euros a ton, where for BECCS it's probably somewhere between 200 and 400. So it's significantly cheaper and already on a larger scale deployable than direct air capture at this moment. And these price ranges reflect what it needs to make these technologies happen at the moment.
Yeah, excellent. Also, thank you for the numbers again. I think this is also something that we really have to be aware of, that we need a broad portfolio, but of course to see also BECCS comparison to DECCS, that BECCS, of course, in most of the cases is going to be maybe the cheaper option, and also provides at the same time energy. So this is something that we really should take into consideration when looking in both of the technologies. And also within our group, what we see is the question also when technologies are available and also when they are needed. So this is also something that we also at the moment discuss within the group, and I think you will also then see in our publications in some time to come, where we also discuss the question of permanence and also when the different technologies or different CDR options maybe could be helpful to be used in general. So we will also have a general short discussion in comparison to BECCS. So always in comparison to BECCS as our focus or core topic here. Okay, this brings me to the next question, which is actually a bit out of our general focus that we're looking into at the moment. But we found it very interesting also to cover it here. And it goes like, I suppose some of those CCS plants involve underground ejections. Do you have any data about middle long-term effects on the area and the residing populations? So, and here I would like to ask Christian Beng to share some information on this.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I answered it just in text as well. I think it was Federico, so I asked. Thank you very much for the question. I know that the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, BECCUS, as well as the Danish Energy Agency have made some studies, and they're available on their website. I put the link there. And it's going to become more and more of an issue going forward in Denmark here when they announce the onshore storage, because this is going to be part of the licensees when they win these exploration permits. This is some of the things the studies they have to undertake. So stay tuned. There should be even more information coming soon.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Christian, for this. And I think this brings us also to maybe to summarize at the end a bit also our focus topics that we're having at the moment. So I mentioned we are looking in this jointly with different member countries that are signed to the IAA Banshee since 2019. And what we basically do is usually looking into case studies in different countries. So how are they looking into BECCS or BECCU? How are they progressing? And at the moment, next to these different countries that you're looking into, we also look in this question: what is the question of storage versus utilization? So these are the aspects that we're dealing with. So you will also hear a lot more of this in the coming months. So also this, we are planning a publication to shed some light on this aspect, also to see would it be more first to utilize and then to store, but what would it then mean for negative emissions? So these are the things, and more in the outlook, we also plan to look into more biochar, because this is a question that also is in the chat, and I would take this question as something concluding that there was a question raised if we also look into biological CDRs, or let's say some other land-based CDRs. So this is not the case. So we are looking really into BECCS and biochar. So really these biogenic solutions from CDR technologies. And then of course, link it also sometimes to DAX as a reference case or reference technology. But our core business is really biomass-based CDR technologies. So I think this is something maybe also important to highlight in the work that we're doing, and also for you as the audience, for you to expect what is to be published and communicated from us in the coming days, weeks, months, years. So we have reached 4:30, so right on time. I'm really glad that we had all these speakers here today. Thank you to everyone, to Dave, Karin, Christian, and Jens for being part of this webinar today. And also thank you, of course, on behalf of Task 40 and the whole IEA Bioenergy network for you, the audience, joining us. And all the recordings and the presentations, as also indicated in the chat in the Q&A, you'll receive later on the IEA Bioenergy website. And if I recall correctly from Chiara, I think the recording will be already up by tomorrow. So these are the concluding remarks. And then we want to close this webinar. Bye-bye from us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.